Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our June Liberal Values Lab with Dr. Tabia Lee. If you joined us last week for our panel discussion, Lee was here, gave us a little overview of her empowered social justice resources. And this time around, she is taking center stage and sharing with us what her social justice resources are, how we can use them. And also, I will keep in the notes for this the link to all of her workshops that she's having this summer so that you can get more of her social justice resources and how to use them and why why you made them in the first place, Lee, which might be a good place to start. But with that, I'm going to pass the mic to you and let you get started.
All right. Thank you so much to Jen and the Institute for Liberal Values for the opportunity to be in community with everyone again and to do a little launch event for the Empowered Social Justice Resources. For those who may be wondering, the opening slide here is actually from a film from the once great National Education Association. The film was called The Freedom to Learn. This was released in 1954, and it was about a teacher, a social studies teacher, who was being castigated by her community for teaching her students about the ideology of communism. And one of the great things that was said in this film was that teachers shouldn't be teaching their students what to think, but how to think. And also that if we don't understand certain ideologies and what the tenets of them are and what they stand for, it's really difficult to combat or even address it. So we all need that freedom to learn and the freedom to understand and to better understand the ideologies that are at play in our classrooms and in our teaching and learning environments. So, as Jen mentioned in the intro, I am a lifelong educator and a teacher trainer, professional development and curriculum designer. And when I looked around and saw the state of social justice education, I knew that something needed to take place and that there needed to be a change. There needed to be alternatives. There needed to be viewpoint diversity in the field because at the present time, there is a default perspective that's guiding most of the work in social justice education. And so that's what gave the inspiration for the guiding principles, the empowered social justice standards for grades K through 12, which I'll speak about in just a moment as well, the ethnic studies framework for grades 9 through 12, and the glossary and instructional resources. And if you haven't had a chance to grab those, I'll put it in the chat, and I believe also an email will go out later with some of the links that are referenced in today's presentation. So, what are the social justice standards in case you may not be in touch or in tune with social justice education and what's happening in American K through 12 schools? The group, the Southern Poverty Law Center, has developed what they call social justice standards. And this often happens in terms of ideological subversion and capture when organizations or groups claim certain terms, like they've claimed the term social justice and they just call their standards the social justice standards as if there's only one way to look at the topic. And there's been several organizations and watchdog parent and civil rights and civil liberties organizations who have really looked at these standards and found a number of problems with them. So this one's coming from the Family Research Council. And they say the so-called social justice standards from the Southern Poverty Law Center were not devised or written by any educational authority at the state or federal level. Even at a local level, no school board committee drafted this document, debated it, and voted on the contents, or deemed it appropriate for school use. Instead, Southern Poverty Law Center executives crafted these highly political, quote, anti-bias framework standards to further their progressive partisan agenda. The SPLC mails these standards directly to school administrators and actively encourages their use by offering teacher training and other staff support to ensure widespread adoption. This leaves parents and taxpayers in the dark. These standards were developed in an undemocratic way by an organization that just claimed the banner of social justice, and they are definitely advancing a critical social justice ideology and identitarian politics, which many groups find deeply concerning, but that doesn't stop the fact that the standards are in use in K through 12 schools throughout America. Another group that raised some questions and concerns about these standards and about the teaching of social justice topics under these standards by the Southern Poverty Law Center is Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And as they note, this new radicalized version of CRT, critical race theory, rejects in particular two crucial interrelated principles. One, the existence of objective truth, and two, the existence of a common human nature. The rejection of objective truth, right, eliminates the possibility of constructive dialogue and leaves only power relations. And the rejection of the existence of a common human nature eliminates the possibility of human personality and leaves only group identities. And these are some of the many reasons that a counterpoint is definitely needed to these standards, and why, and I was inspired to create the empowered social justice standards so that teachers have an alternative pathway to introduce social topics to students in ways that are not dehumanizing and degrading in the way that the so-called social justice standards developed by Southern Poverty Law Center are. So in today's setting, I'll be speaking of social justice approaches for those who may not, again, be as familiar about what's happening in education, understanding the difference between classical and critical. I'll talk about advancing classical social justice, and then what's the road ahead and what do things look like for us? And of course, we'll have Q&A after. So first, I'd like to touch on social justice approaches so that we're all understanding the various approaches that can be used and the ideologies that are underlying. So there are some different foundational assertions that you may be using depending on which approach to social justice that you're taking in your classroom, in your learning environment, in civic environments, in training environments. If you're looking at critical social justice or social justice from a critical perspective, some of the foundational assertions you may hold are that America was founded on and is irretrievably rooted in white supremacy. You may also have a foundational assertion that systemic racism is baked into American society and is the cause of every disparity. Working from a classical social justice perspective, your foundational assertions may be quite different in that thinking, instead of being founded on white supremacy, that America was founded on and is rooted in the aspirational goals of fairness and equality for all. And also, another foundational assertion you may have, if you're working from a classical perspective, is that racism is not the cause of every disparity. So I'm going to step through some various components of social justice approaches so that you can just kind of really get clear in your mind the distinction between a critical and a classical, because I find that having the names and the words of these things is very helpful to people and really helpful to help us understand which approach most aligns with us personally and as a community. Something else you'll see different depending on how a teacher is addressing social justice topics is the instructional tools and methodologies that may be in use. A teacher working from a critical social justice perspective, you may hear them speaking and using tools like decentering whiteness. Another one that you may hear is raising critical consciousness, and also the liberation struggles of BIPOC, that means Black, Indigenous, people of color, and intersectionality. Those are all tools and methodologies that you may see in use when a critical social justice approach is being taken. On the other hand, a classical social justice approach, what are some key instructional tools and methodologies you may see in use? You may see things mentioned like American pluralism, raising social consciousness. You may also see things like a discussion or a centering of the contributions of diverse minoritized people to e pluribus unum and a more perfect union. What about race and gender ideologies? In the early it was the early 2000s, late 1990s, I coined the phrase ideology in practice and started using it in my teacher trainings and professional development. And I was trying to help teachers to understand and to better recognize the ideologies of various sorts that they embody and enact in their classrooms. And it's just a strange universe to me. At that time, no one was talking about ideologies in education so much. But now you turn on the news, and anytime education is mentioned, they're talking about these various race ideologies or gender ideologies. And it's just great to see people awakening and recognizing the importance of it. So how does approaching these two particular ideologies, which are by no means comprehensive, right? We have political ideologies, there are religious ideologies. I mean, there's all kinds of ideologies or worldviews that you can have. But right now in our classrooms in K through 12 and higher ed, you see a strong emphasis on race and gender ideology. So that's why I'm targeting these two and helping people better understand how each philosophy approaches. So critical social justice will support developing identity based on racial and gender identity checkboxes. It embraces race essentialism and gender identity stereotypes. And it also explores the historical and contemporary effects of heterosexism, cis heteropatriarchy, and more. These things are all centered and focused on from grades kindergarten on up through college education under a critical approach. A classical approach, on the other hand, really looks at developing a value-centered identity. It's a rejection of race essentialism and gender identity stereotypes, and it explores the historical and contemporary effects of human agency, resilience, and more. So again, these aren't comprehensive. We're just kind of hitting at high level on what these different approaches look like and how we may see them manifest. Another way to think about this is what does the philosophy or the ideology recommend and promote? Critical social justice, classrooms, you'll hear terms like anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, all of those anti forms of thinking and learning. And these practices, they prioritize discrimination, present discrimination, as a remedy for past discrimination. And what really is being sought under a critical social justice framework or ideology is the equality of outcomes in all of society. A classical perspective, on the other hand, really you would hear more terms like liberal democratic values, inquiry-based, um, objective pluralism, empowered pathways or empowered humanity-informed ideas, and a prioritizing of human dignity and equal treatment of all under the law. So you would see a focus on equality of opportunity. That brings me to, one moment, please. A little bit of a cough there. That brings me to just a quick summary of, what is critical social justice ideology? What are some of the core tenets? And I really appreciate the work of Helen Pluckrose, who has, in her latest book, outlined 7 tenets that really are present whenever you see a critical social justice approach being used. And some of these things, as a teacher or an administrator or a legislator or a community leader, when you see these things and people talking about these concepts, they're definitely speaking in the language of critical social justice. And it's helpful to be able to recognize that. And what are some of the core tenets of it? So one is that all white people are racist. Another is that being non-racist isn't possible. Masculinity is pathological. Sex is not biological and exists on a spectrum. Disbelief in the concept of gender identity is killing people, so a centering of that. And also language being viewed as literally violence, and everything needs to be decolonized. So these are some of the core tenets of the gospel of critical social justice. I really like the way that Pluckrose refers to this as the gospel, because it is enacted in that way. And I'm just going to her book on page 23, where she says that these core tenets are expressed with absolute certainty and unquestionable. And it really helps to make everything into a zero-sum political struggle around identity and power dynamics and experiences and knowledges that are believed to be held therein. So really just helping folks to understand in a quick way, what are the core tenets and how can I recognize it even better? when I talk about this, often people say, well, this isn't really happening in schools and this isn't really going on. And, why even focus on it? One of the things about ideological subversion and the ideological subversion that's taking place through social justice education and teaching and learning right now in American schools is the advancement of bad ideas. In America, we have the free marketplace of ideas, and we allow all ideas to be expressed, and we welcome them. And unfortunately, what sometimes happens is that even bad ideas sometimes rise to the top and become part of popular culture before they've been fully vetted. And we end up stuck with a bad idea as part of popular knowledge that really isn't rooted in any educational research or data. So here we're seeing from the New York public school system, a teacher celebrating how they taught their fifth graders about white privilege, and they taught them to think of examples of where this privilege lives in our daily world. So no question of, is white privilege even a valid construct or even something that exists outside of a sociologist's imagination, but telling students that this is something real and it's something you need to give me examples of in our world without question for it. I really love this counterpoint from another social media person, Dr. Verling, who says it teaches Black children that the mere sight of a white person signals their permanent systemic subjugation. Not a good way to start out in life. Another example, people say, this isn't really in schools. It's not happening. We don't teach these things. Well, here's from an expose from Jill Tucker in the San Francisco Chronicle. This is a book that's read to kindergarten students called So You Made It to a Protest. If you're wondering how all of our students are learning how to protest and how to walk out of their classrooms, they're actually being read books about how to make it to a protest and what they should see. And in this instance, a Bay Area school district hired this group, Woke Kindergarten, to come in and teach their program and teach students about protesting and other topics. And the test scores of the targeted students fell, as well as all students' test scores fell, because this isn't about reading or math or social studies or science or any academic discipline. This is actual indoctrination into a critical social justice ideology. And I don't know, it's up to you in your community to decide if our pre-kindergarten students need to learn about queer power over fear power, for example, and all the other things that are stated in this particular book. Another thing that we see in critical social justice ideology in our K through 12 schools is rampant and willful anti-Semitism. Here you're seeing some samples from the Teach Palestine, and this is a pre-kindergarten curriculum for K through 12 students. So students as young as pre-K on up through 12th grade. This is a read aloud book that a teacher may be sharing with their students. And as you can see, I will just share some of it. This is only a couple of pages. And from a span of the book. So, you can only imagine what the rest is like. But our pre-kindergarten students are being taught things like, when I was only 10 years old, I had to flee my home in Palestine. A group of bullies called Zionists wanted our land, so they stole it by force and hurt many people. My mama and I cried a lot. Palestinians call this experience the Nakba. Terrible things keep happening today in Palestine. Children like me keep having their homes taken by Zionist bullies. They are always scaring them and arresting them. My friends and I call this an ongoing Nakba. We want this to stop happening, so we always shout out, Free Palestine. So as a parent or an educator or anyone who's concerned about, what our pre-kindergarten students are learning, okay, these are students who haven't even learned about geography or world history or any of the things that would help them to understand the critical social justice narrative that's being pushed here and the falsehoods and the historical inaccuracies that are herein. Instead, they're using words that kids know, like bullies, and they're labeling Zionists as bullies. So any young child in that classroom who might later identify as a Zionist, they're learning right away that that's a bad thing to be. And they're learning about things that are just not appropriate or developmentally, historically accurate. or even truthful. It's just pure anti-Semitism and narrative weaving. And unfortunately, when you go to school and you start out in pre-K with your teacher reading this to you, then you go up the next grade and you hear even more of the same narrative. That's how we get what we see on our college campuses right now and in our streets. And it's purely due to the education that you receive or don't receive. Another problem with this, as I outlined in the core tenets, right, this idea of critical social justice, the gender identity ideologies are just as forced upon students and colleagues as the race ideologies. So here you're seeing a couple of examples. Again, people sometimes tell me these things aren't really happening, but the genderbread unicorn and the genderbread person are both tools that are being used in our pre-kindergarten upward classrooms. This is before children even know what a boy or a girl is. They're being taught about gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. And so again, is it developmentally appropriate? These are things for people to become informed about and to learn about what their schools are doing and to take action and find out what aligns with what you're wanting to see. So also what's taking place is just a subversion of the language, putting reality upside down. Everything that we used to know or say has now been inverted. For example, a teacher is now someone who teaches you that all white people are racist, right? That's what aligns with critical social justice ideology. It's not about math or reading or social studies or science or any of the core subjects. It's about teaching children and young adults that all white people are racist. And, you know, it's telling us that violent protests, burning down and occupying buildings are peaceful. It's telling us that multi-millionaire artists are oppressed. It's telling us that males are women and so many other things that you can see here. The inversion of reality, flipping every word and term upside down. And that's very intentional because we learn through communication with one another. When we turn on our news and they're telling us what affirming care is, and what it really means is something completely different. That is ideological subversion at work and the manipulation of language in particular, which is very important to capture the language, to redefine it, and demand that others play a part in that and participate in it too, to signal their fidelity to the critical social justice ideology. So really what we're talking about is an illiberal approach and a liberal approach to social justice. When we're looking at that critical, liberated, or illiberal way of teaching social justice, you'll see a focus on rejecting objective knowledge and truth, on collective experience trumping individuality and universality, never spoken of. You'll see ascribing of collective blame to dominant groups. This idea that the most oppressed deserve equal outcomes and they must have them by any means necessary. This idea that everything, there hasn't really been progress. And this pessimistic skepticism about reality and the state of the world and progress at large. A liberal or empowered approach, though, to teaching social justice would really more focus on centering truth, objectivity, and merit in justice. You would hear things like rights belong to individuals, not to groups, an appeal to fairness and empathy, a focus on equal citizenship, or this idea that everyone deserves equal rights and opportunities, and really a cultivation of reason and compassion, and a recognition of progress that's been made. Instead of rejecting all progress and saying no progress has been made, there would be a recognition of the progress that has been made and the work that still needs to be done. So I hope that you'll keep learning more about social justice approaches. Some of the slides that I went through with the Venn diagrams where I was kind of outlining the differences between a critical and a classical approach. I have a one-pager available for that you're welcome to download. And these links will be provided as well. And also, I have a one-pager on social justice approaches in the medical profession, because this is a field, the medical field is a field where the social justice disciplines and topics have been pushed in by critical social justice ideologues. And it's overtaking medical training and education as well. So how do we advance classical social justice? I've outlined the differences between a critical and a classical approach. How do we advance classical? Well, one tool, as I mentioned earlier, that I developed is the Empowered Social Justice Resources. And you can download those and find these different components in there. There are other organizations working on different social justice approaches as well. So I encourage folks to check those out too. And another thing is I really want to emphasize to people that as we're talking about advancing classical social justice, by no means are we saying that we need to get rid of critical social justice or not have it taught in any school. That is not my aim. Of course, I'm not a politician or a policymaker or anyone like that. I'm just a teacher, so the different realms may be responding in different ways, but from my perspective, those who embrace a liberal approach, and that doesn't mean that you're a Republican or a Democrat or left or right. When I'm speaking of liberalism, and I'll define that in a couple of steps here, I'm really speaking of something that is relevant to every American citizen. So it doesn't go by your party affiliation or whether you're left or right or all these other things. Sometimes you'll see these words used in different ways. And so it's important for me to clarify it. So what I'm really seeking to do, at least as an educator, is to create space for viewpoint diversity, because right now there is a dominance of critical social justice ideology, and it makes no room for any other perspective. And in fact, you'll hear the proponents of these programs, critical social justice programs, talking about the authentic way to teach it, the only way to teach it, the things that must be studied and things that must not be studied, and all of these other kinds of ways. So we're not trying to say that people that want to do that should not be able to. We need to defend people's right to disbelieve in critical social justice, just as we must defend the right of people to believe in it. So I'm calling for an equal footing in the academy in all levels in terms of the way that we teach social justice, and allowing people to do what aligns with their teaching philosophy, and to be transparent about it and to start naming it so we can all understand where our various educators are coming from and where they're trying to take us. Okay. So when I speak about that, what are liberal values? Because I've been saying that this is a program, right? The Empowered Social Justice Resources, that advances liberal values. So you'll see many definitions of liberal values. Again, this is just one that I'm using to get people started thinking and talking about it. So in the center, you see democracy being one of the values, limited government, a separation of church and state, universal human rights, freedom of expression, respect for the value of differing opinions and honest debate, and equality for women, racial minorities, and LGBT people. Just writ large, what are liberal values? When we think of liberal democratic values, and being really specific to the American context, that's when we're talking about free and fair elections, the right to private property, respect for individual rights and fundamental freedoms, the independence of the branches of government, which you have to learn about before you can hold them accountable, and which we're not learning much about in today's schools, pluralistic system of political parties and organizations, equality before the law, and the consent of the governed. And giving you the sources of where I got that, which I will touch on in a bit here as well too. So I really want to emphasize that this approach and this elevation of liberal democratic values is being taken because the current critical social justice approach is very illiberal in nature. And I've outlined that in the previous slides. But I really want to emphasize that liberalism matters. And I love this quote. Again, this is from Helen Pluckrose's latest. Says, while liberals on either side of the political spectrum may disagree on economic issues and other issues of policy, they are united in their support for individual liberty, common humanity, freedom of belief and speech, the value of viewpoint diversity, and the need for consistent principles in which the same rules and freedoms apply to everyone. So again, this idea that liberalism doesn't belong to anyone, it belongs to everyone. It's not a left or right. It's not a Republican or Democrat or Green or Peace and Social Justice or whatever other party. Belongs to everyone. And so that's why these resources were created. Not only have I had experience in very illiberal critical social justice dominated spaces, specifically in the California community college system, which is currently advancing critical social justice ideologies through all 100 schools from the top down. Um, I see the danger of that and the concern of that, and the fact that some people want to have a wraparound ideological indoctrination into critical social justice ideology that goes from the cradle, pre-K, on up through higher ed, and that's deeply concerning. So that was an inspiration for making these things. I do have touchstone texts that I encourage people to use if they want to take this approach. So this isn't like a pre-packaged curriculum. This is a framework, and it's made to be adaptable to local context. So it doesn't belong to any one state. The empowered social justice standards are national standards, and these touchstone texts are national texts that should be in any class where you're speaking about empowered social justice or trying to help your students. So number one, learn about liberal democratic values. Tap into the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Men, the American Convention on Human Rights, and the Inter-American Democratic Charter. All of those texts should be known by students who are looking into social justice topics. Another thing, if you're going to speak on racial classification, I always tell people there's a couple of David Bernsteins you want to know. You want to know David E. Bernstein, who speaks about Classify, the Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. Another book to understand how anti-Semitism is operating in many critical social justice spaces is David L. Bernstein's book, Woke Anti-Semitism. Those are two that I would say are very important to understand how racial classification is operating in America and the kind of history behind both. And then also The Arc of a Bad Idea, Understanding and Transcending Race by Carlos Hoyt. And I refer to some specific chapters. So teachers first need to read and understand these documents and be able to, if you're going to speak about race, then you really need to do it from an informed perspective. From one that recognizes that race and ethnicity are contested topics in American history, and to know the history of those classification systems and how they've worked is very critical because then we can, as we say, when you know better, you can do better. Another thing is to know about the race ideologies, not just for teachers, but for students as well. There are various people working, for example, in our homes and our neighborhoods from an anti-racist ideology. Some people are working from a colorblind ideology, and some people are working from a raceless ideology, and there are many more. These are just three to kind of get started and to really better understand our neighbors and how they think. And then two, when we do a look back to the past and at primary source documents and other tools and resources we should be using when teaching about social justice, we should be analyzing those different approaches to equal citizenship, movements, whatever they may be, through these various lenses, especially if we're teaching students racialized concepts and ideas as we talk about it. If we're speaking of race, we should be talking about the different ideologies and the ways of seeing it, and not just presenting one as the only one and the only way to see it, because it's just not true. That's teaching lies when we do that. And we've got to teach truth and give everybody the freedom to learn. So also wrapping up here, we have resources that we recommend for the empowered social justice. Again, this is not meant to be a prescriptive framework or to tell you how to teach, but we have taken a look at different ways of getting to the information. So primary and secondary sources, cultural histories. Of course, since we are a country of law and order, laws and policies would be something you might be looking at when you talk about social justice in a learning-centered manner instead of an activist-centered manner. And then two, data, oral histories, various other things, which in future workshops we'll unpack more. Today, just very high level overview. We have workshops that we're doing this summer. We just had one on ideological subversion. Coming up on July 10th, we'll be doing guiding principles. So those are for teachers, and it centers really Jason Littlefield's empowered humanity theory is what we have based our guiding principles on, among other theories, but that is a central one because it's about practices and attitudes that we can use to really reimagine the way that we're teaching social justice topics in a classical oriented way that centers liberal values, liberal democratic values. We also have the standards and resources coming up on July 24th. And then August 7th will be just about teaching ethnic studies, because there's been a lot of concern about that, and specifically the critical liberated ethnic studies model, which was a gift from California that has spread throughout the nation. And it is very concerning to teachers, parents, community members, and others, just because of some of the content of it, some of the in present times, virulent anti-Semitism that's there, and the gender identity ideologies as well. So we'll talk about all that and why it is like that in critical liberated ethnic studies and the alternative ways, including empowered social justice. And I also offer workshops, trainings, and supports beyond these free workshops that I'm doing on drtlee.com. And finally, I've reached the end. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Jen. And I'm ready to take some questions if folks have them there.
We do. And speaking of democracy and pluralism and viewpoint diversity, we are a little tight tonight because we've got our first debate. So I'm going to try to hit some of the highest questions up here. And so we might come back with you via email with some other questions in the future. But this was great. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Lee. So one of the questions that's coming up, and I think this is, I have this question myself, as a matter of fact, just not being a teacher. My understanding is there are certain educational standards. So for every curricula, you have to check certain boxes that for a history curricula, you have to have certain boxes checked. You're talking about how the Southern Poverty Law Center has these social justice standards. Have they been adopted? And again, I'm not sure how these check boxes get made in the first place. I don't know if it's by the National Education Association or school districts themselves, but how are these social justice standards part of these curricula check boxes? Is this something that's been adopted in that manner?
Yes. So there are subject standards, and this is something I'll get into when I talk about the history of ethnic studies in particular, because it uses the same playbook that this social justice standards development has used in terms of making demands on people, telling them that they must teach, certain topics. If they don't, they're not really doing the work, they're not doing authentic work, and so forth. And really, the Southern Poverty Law Center standards, as was mentioned by Family Research Council, they weren't made by any collective or group, or it was made by, people in a think tank, if you want to call it that. And it's something that has evolved, that's mailed out to schools, and that some individual teachers have taken into their classroom, and some whole schools have adopted and are using. So it's deeply concerning when you really get into it and you see not just the topics that you would expect. When we speak about social justice, I think about like equal rights, equal citizenship movements, and times that individuals and groups stood up and called for greater access to equal citizenship. That's what I think of. But this topic and the way that the standards are organized really does delve deep into race identity ideologies and gender identity ideologies and queer theory for K through 12 students. And it's deeply concerning for many of us because so many of the things are being suggested to be adopted and used early on, like pre-K students need to learn about cis heteronormativity, are, you know, the patriarchy. I don't know, maybe some adults don't even know what those things are, and some of the new invented terms, especially the newly invented terms. So why are we teaching that to our pre-K students before we can even get into their ABCs and what is your name and how do you spell it and print it on paper in proper, you know, handwriting. So that's what's taking place in the schools, being uncritically adopted. No educational body. I don't think the Department of Education has gone that deep off yet. But I haven't seen the documentation of them saying that the social justice standards from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which are really critical social justice standards, should be the norm. But I haven't seen that yet, you know, as far as like a federal body doing that.
Okay. Another common question here is this idea. You started out your talk with a slide that gave a back and forth of communism and democracy. What is the link between communism and critical theory, and why do we see kind of them overlapping so much in the way we're educating? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yes. And again, I'm sorry all the juicy stuff is with ethnic studies, but really it's one of the places where so many things blossom. So that used to be a fringe department, you know, on a campus. Now it's a center, it's in the center. The EI policies are often being led by, you know, our ethnic studies, gender studies, American studies, so forth studies professors. And these are tenured professors who've been working at this for some time. And the problem is that when you look at the roots of even that and the Third World Liberation Front, for example, which started in California and started this whole wrong-headed idea that there are only four racialized ethnically minoritized groups that should be studied, and that all others, you know, have had their just desserts and their time in the sun, if you will, and that we should ignore the other groups and instead just focus on four. And they called themselves the Third World Liberation Front, coming out of San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley in the 60s. And really rooted in and not shy about being connected to communist agitators and communist movements, and including also some of the philosophies, you know, of critical pedagogy, as well, are unabashedly and happy to be affiliated with communist movement, communist thought. But what you see is even a debasing of that, and that's why you see some scholars talk about neo-marxism, you know, and how race and gender ideologies have replaced class, and you know, all of these kind of things. So I think that it's important to understand those roots and the connections. And when you think about the opposition to liberalism, and that's something that the Critical Liberated Ethnic Studies Coalition and others um, have said liberalism is an enemy. They say liberalism and Zionism specifically are enemies to them. And when you look at what is liberalism and what is Zionism, then you have a better understanding of the illiberal nature of the people that are speaking and their worldview, and what they seek for the world, and how aligned that it is with very nihilistic movements, and often very quite proudly associated, you know, with communist agitation and movements. And that doesn't square with American values. And I mean by American, if you're far left, far right, center, wherever you are, you know, whatever party you're with, I don't think it makes a difference when someone says death to America. They mean all of America. When they say death to Israel, they mean all of Israel. So it doesn't matter, you know, who you are, where your allegiances lie, or who you're rooting for in the debate tonight, or if you're having pizza for what side. It doesn't really make a difference because it's all the same when you get to the extremes, and they seek to dehumanize and destabilize, undermine, and really not just disrupt, but dismantle America and the Western way of life. And when you think about that, and I know certain things take importance for people, and we're all struggling with things and just meeting groceries and bills and whatever it may be, um, failing to see what's around you and what's being stated and just blinding yourself to that at this moment, it's a very precarious choice to make. And I hope that people aren't making that choice. I see more and more every day, Jen, people who are starting to ask more questions, and they're starting to write letters, and they're starting to like get involved. People who previously were like, I don't have kids in school, or it doesn't really matter. They're realizing like the kids in school are all going to be our community, our doctors, our lawyers, our McDonald's workers, our librarians. These are the kids in schools. And so what they're learning is so crucial for everybody to be involved in, whether you have kids in the district or not. When you see these things, and now that you understand a little bit, hopefully more of the core tenets, some of the buzzwords that you may note, that can help you as well to know where to target, the oversight that needs to take place, the accountability that needs to take place, and the widening of the lens, to be more inclusive, so that our kids have a better chance at having critical thinking and understanding of what it means to be American.
You kind of answered where I was going with the last question that we have here, but
Oh.
I'll restate it or I'll state it anyways. I mean, the question is, why this narrative in the first place? What is the end goal? And so I think by you answering the question on the mix between like communism and critical theory, we can kind of see the end goal. And what you just mentioned about how it matters beyond education, because at the end goal, and correct me if I'm wrong, and feel free to put a finer point on what you just said, is the end goal is truly destruction, is it not?
I mean, I find those aims very nihilistic. When you want to confuse people about natural law and biological fact, that's concerning for me. When you want to confuse people about world history and race and ethnicity, and what is indigeneity and how do we understand it, and when you want to make a narrative that's just counter to reality and historical fact, and tell people that it's fact and they may not question you, I I have deep concerns about that, and it doesn't just stop at the schoolhouse. That's the training ground, and always has been, whether we like that or not. That's a training ground for civil engagement and involvement in your community. And so when you get there and you learn, oh, I'm in pre-K. Okay, I say free Palestine because that's what my teacher said, because there's bullies, there are bad people. Oh, they're Zionists. My teacher's not Zionist, of course. They rooted all those out. They're not allowed in schools anymore. I mean, no, this that's not the future that I'm thinking of, for our youth and our young people. Just the way it will impact their thinking process, their community engagement, their participation. If you don't know what the branches of government are, if you haven't read the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, or even just been exposed to parts, through exercises, however it's done in your school, if you have no familiarity with those things, those documents, that really outline a worldview that is one that is applicable to everyone who's here, and why they've chosen to be here at this point in time, most people, right? So I wonder for the future of everyone, if we're not widening the lens of how we teach social justice topics. In a way, it's a harkening back, because many of these things were things that my teachers did, when I was going through school, and that have really helped shape who I am as a young person. So sometimes people say, oh, so you're saying instead of indoctrinating them with critical social justice, you want to indoctrinate them with empowered social justice. And really, we need to better understand indoctrination and ideological thinking to really unpack that, because it's not saying that by any means. And indoctrination is a different pedagogical vehicle and methodology than teaching and learning about a topic like social justice, or civics, or history, or ethnic studies, if we want to consider that a valid realm of study.
I would say actually though, and this is something that our friend Eric Smith is popular saying, that liberalism, when done correctly, or social justice when done correctly is liberalism, or is it the other way around? Liberalism when done correctly is social justice. I would also say what I'm hearing you say as well, this is what you're talking about with empowered social justice, to me just sounds like the basis of good civics.
Yes, and as a former civics teacher and civics program designer, you see that reflected in the design of this, because I think that that's something so important for us to understand. Now, on the critical social justice side of things, you hear about a thing called action civics, which again, it's just more the same race and gender ideologies and activating students to be co-conspirators, and activists. And I don't think that that's something that is doing what even the people who are promoting that thought it would do. And it's unfortunate, and I don't think that should be the only option for our youth. I think that people should be able to learn about the real contested history of race and ethnicity in America, um, movements for equal citizenship, and two, how do I be a positive change maker? What does nonviolent change look like, and how has it looked in the past? On the critical social justice side, we've seen a glorification of violence by the people who've created the materials and even in their curricula that they're bringing to students, as I showed earlier, some of the examples of that. And it's really unfortunate, but we do have to, at this time, like, say, as educators, is that the only way that we want people to learn, or are we open to other ways that don't involve dehumanization and willful ignorance and outright lying and hatred of different groups of people, and to exclusion again, under the banner of inclusion, complete exclusion, willful exclusion of multiple people, individuals and groups who have contributed to American society and made this grand experiment what it is today. We to pretend that we should only study 4 groups: Native American, Black, Mexican, and Asian, which is what the Third World Liberation Front consisted of, and that's what their name comes from, those 4 groups. If we're going to say we should only teach about those groups in every subject, whenever we're talking about social justice, oh, and then we can add on a couple that weren't there originally, but it fits our narrative that we're trying to make people believe in about the world and how it functions in human societies. So we'll let some other groups in, but not these ones. No, it's getting outrageous, and it's beyond outrageous, and it's so harmful for our young people to grow up without the opportunity to think critically, and to have the freedom to learn and to understand these different things that people are throwing at them. What are the ideologies behind it? So that I, as a learner, can decide what sounds best to me, or what resonates with my values, or how, my community, my family, my thoughts are. So that's not what we have happening at this time. So it's trying to broaden that lens.
Well, Dr. Lee, thank you again so much for your time. And like I mentioned before, speaking of viewpoint diversity, we are going to end a little bit early so that we can go and see our government in action with the debates tonight. And for everyone, thank you for your patience in joining us with a little bit of my circle snafu. But all these resources are going to be both on our YouTube, and Dr. Lee, I will put all the images or all the links that you had also shared in your images on the YouTube page too. So stay tuned for that if it went by too quickly and you want to be able to have the resources there handy for you. So thank you again. Appreciate you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.